Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fighting Cheyennes by George Bird Grinnell, narrated by Bob Souer. Preface. This book deals with the wars of the Cheyennes. A fighting and a fearless people, the tribe was almost constantly at war with its neighbors, but until 1856 was friendly to the whites. The Cheyennes fought well, but they will fight no more. Their wars have long been over. Their tribal wanderings ceased before 1880. Since then they have been confined on two reservations, one in Oklahoma, the other in Montana. When their struggles with the white men began, some of their older and wiser men strove earnestly to preserve peace, but their efforts failed. In an Indian camp, individual liberty is the law, and the Cheyennes were a proud, headstrong, and obstinate people. During these first wars between the whites and the Cheyennes, the United States government was struggling for its very life. Its attention was concentrated on the war between the North and the South, and the movements of a few Indians on the thinly settled frontier attracted little notice. The so-called Sand Creek Massacre took place toward the close of the Civil War, and the ensuing interference with trans-Missouri travel led to an inquiry by Congress. The published results of this inquiry first made this tribe known to the general public. As more and more people pushed into the West, there was more and more fighting with Indians, until in 1878 and 1879 it ceased, so far as the Cheyennes were concerned. For many years, the government of the Indians by the United States was carried on in haphazard and often dishonest fashion by officials alike ignorant and careless of the customs and ways of thought of the savages with whom they were dealing. The killing of a large number of men, women, and children at Fort Robinson in January 1879 was the direct result of such unfortunate ignorance. Since the Indians could not write, the history of their wars has been set down by their enemies, and the story has been told always from the hostile point of view. White writers have lauded white courage and claimed white successes. If it has been necessary to confess defeat, they have abused those who overcame them, as the defeated always abuse the victors. Evidently there is another side to this history, and this other side is one which should be recorded. And since the wars are now distant in time, the Indians' own descriptions of these battles may be read without much prejudice. I have tried to present the accounts by whites and Indians without comment. I acknowledge with cordial thanks help received from friends who took part in the later Cheyenne Wars, and who have commented on and criticized the chapters dealing with the battles in which they fought. These accounts are thus, in fact, narratives by eyewitnesses. Such assistance has been given me by Major General E.S. Godfrey, by Major General W.S. Schuyler, by Colonel Homer W. Wheeler, by Colonel D.L. Brainerd, by Colonel E.P. Andrus, by Captain L.H. North, by George Bent, and by many Cheyenne friends whose names are mentioned in the text. Besides this, Mr. Charles B. Reynolds has kindly read the manuscript, and Mr. George E. Hyde has verified most of the references and has given me the benefit of his careful study of the history of early travel on the plains. To all these friends I return hearty thanks. A long association with the Cheyennes has given me a special interest in them and a special wish that they should be allowed to speak for themselves. What the Indian saw in the battles here described, and in many others, I have learned during years of intimate acquaintance with those who took part in them. The old-time Cheyennes possessed in high degree the savage virtues of honesty, trustworthiness, and bravery in the men, and of courage, devotion, and chastity in the women. Of the older people who took part in the fighting with the white troops, some are still living, and today are the only sources of original information concerning the former ways of the wild Cheyennes, the old free life of the western plains. George Bird Grinnell, August 10th, 1915. The Fighting Cheyennes. 1. The Cheyennes. The Cheyennes are one of three groups of Indians of the western plains belonging to the Algonquian family. They are recent immigrants to the region. According to the statement of Black Moccasin, who was long regarded as their most reliable historian, the man with the best memory, some of them reached the Missouri River about 1676, 204 winters before 1880 when the statement was made. Before this they had lived for a time on the river bearing their name, which runs into the Red River of the north from the west, and on which one of their old village sites still exists. Earlier still they were in Minnesota. They have traditions of long journeyings before they reached there. For a number of years after coming to the Missouri, the Cheyennes lived on its banks, cultivating the ground and occupying earth lodges not unlike those used up to recent times by the Rees and the Mandans. Gradually they drifted out on the plains and gave up their sedentary habits and began to move about over the prairie, dwelling in skin lodges and following the buffalo. As recently as 1850 they tilled the soil to some extent, and men have described to me their mothers' corn patches on the Little Missouri at about that date. The people whom we know as Cheyennes are made up of two related tribes, Tsistas and Tsutai. The latter have been absorbed by the former and have left hardly any trace. They were the tribe known to early writers as Stayatan, that is, Tsutai hi Tani, a man of the Tsutai. I have known many Cheyennes who remembered old people who were Tsutai, born in the separate Tsutai camp. They agree that the Tsutai language differed somewhat from the Cheyenne, it sounded funny to them, and that the Tsutai had many customs of their own which later were laughed at because unusual. In 1831, at the time when Bent's Fort was completed, the Tsutai, still camped apart by themselves, were still a separate tribe. The name Cheyenne is not in use by the tribe. They call themselves Tsitsitas, a word variously translated which Reverend R. Peter, our authority on the Cheyenne language, believes to mean similarly bred. If this is its meaning, it resembles so many other Indian tribal names which are explained to mean variously the people, the real people, etc., and perhaps actually mean the people, that is, the folks, our folks, us. Tsistas might also mean the cut or gashed people, and the tribal sign signifies cut or gashed, though often explained as referring to striped feathers sometimes but by no means always used in feathering the arrows. The word Cheyenne is frequently explained as coming from the French chien in allusion to the dog soldiers, but it is in fact a Sioux term, Shehaila or Shahaina, people speaking language not understood. The Sioux people speak of those who talk intelligibly to them as white talkers, and call those who speak a language not understood red talkers. Aye or ayi is to talk intelligibly. Ayiske, used as a verb, means to speak fluently and intelligently. As a substantive, the word means an interpreter. In speaking of one who talks their language, the Dakotas use the term skeiya, to talk white. Of one whose language they cannot understand and who cannot understand them, they say sheyiye, to talk red, that is, unintelligibly. The name given by the Sioux to the Cheyennes, Shehaile, means red words or red speech, speaking a foreign tongue. Partly as a result of long association with the village tribes of the Missouri, Rees, Mandans, and Hidatsa, the Cheyennes have among them a strong infusion of foreign blood. A still greater mingling of alien blood comes from their warlike character, so pronounced during many years of the last century, which resulted in the capture from their enemies of great numbers of children of both sexes, who in due course were adopted into the tribe, grew up as Cheyennes, and married and reared children. Old Cheyennes have told me that it is difficult to find any Cheyennes without a strain of foreign blood, and as I think over my acquaintances, I can hardly recall any whose ancestry can be traced far back wholly in the Cheyenne tribe. In another book I have given a list of 28 tribes from which captives had been taken by the Cheyennes. When the Cheyennes first met the white people, they were shy and timid and endeavored to avoid the newcomers. Lewis and Clark speak of this, and old men among the Cheyennes say that they have always been told that in former times the chiefs advised that the white strangers be avoided. This may have some reference to the speech attributed to the Cheyenne culture hero, in which he prophesied a meeting with a people whose skins were white and whose ways were different, and predicted that misfortune to his people would follow their knowledge of these strangers. The late Ben Clark, in the manuscript prepared at the request of General Sheridan, declared that the Cheyennes were called the Kite Indians because perpetually on the move, always seen at a distance and fleeing. Among the tribes of the plains, the Cheyennes have had one ally on whose fidelity they could always depend. These were the Arapahoes, who for many generations have been associated with the Cheyennes on terms of the closest friendship, camping with them for long periods, uniting with them in their wars, or at other times being the medium through whom have come proposals for peace from hostile tribes. The tradition as to when the Arapahoes joined the Cheyennes is vague enough, and we know little about it, though much has been written on the subject. A milder and more easygoing people than the Cheyennes, they yet fought side by side with them in many a stubborn battle. There is a large infusion of Arapaho blood in the Cheyenne tribe, for many Cheyenne men married Arapaho women. On the other hand, it is my impression that comparatively few Cheyenne women have married Arapaho men. Historical knowledge of the Cheyennes begins with the accounts of Lewis and Clark, though many years earlier the French trappers and traders had penetrated their country, which was on the plains near the Black Hills, and especially on the upper courses of certain streams which flow out of those hills. I think it very possible that long before this the Cheyennes had been met by the Vérendrye, and that they may have been the tribe which the Vérendrye Journal terms Jean de l'Arc. Perhaps this can never be shown, but the name Jean du Serpent, given to their enemies by the people of the bow, suggests the Cheyenne term Shishi ne Haiwi Tanyu, snakemen, the name given by the Cheyennes to the Comanches, who, the Cheyennes declare, occupied that country at the time when they reached the neighborhood of the Black Hills. The Cheyenne name for the tribes called snakes by the whites is Sassane. Although the books constantly speak of the Cheyennes as at war with the Sioux, I do not find among them any tradition that they ever had serious quarrels with the plains people whom we know and speak of as Sioux. On the other hand, they were at bitter enmity with the northern Dakota or Assiniboines, and traditions of their wars with them run back a long way. Later enemies were the Kiowas, the Comanches, and the Crows, all of whom they gradually expelled from the country that they had invaded. The Cheyennes were long at war with the Pawnees and with the Shoshone, and these hostilities endured up to the time when intertribal wars ceased. Early in the 19th century, they were at peace with the Kiowas and Comanches, and in the Journal of Jacob Fowler for November 1821 are found references to Kiowa Comanches, Kiowa Apaches, Cheyennes, and Snakes Comanches, traveling together in more or less amity. Cheyenne tradition speaks of the Kiowas as peaceable co-occupants with them of the Little Missouri country long after the Spaniards had come up there from the southwest to trade, and before the Cheyennes had ever seen the French or English whites. The last great battle with the Kiowas, Comanches, and Apaches took place in 1838. 2 years later a peace was made which has not since been broken. The Cheyennes were long at war with the Utes. At the time of the first settlement of western Colorado, after gold had been discovered, miners had come into the country and villages and towns had been established on the flanks of the mountains in that territory. War journeys by Cheyennes and Utes against each other were constantly taking place. The reports from officials of the Indian Service during the years 1862 to 1865 frequently complain of the trouble given to the settlers by the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes in their war journeys against the Utes and by the Utes when they went against the Cheyennes. Farther to the northward, the Cheyennes had other enemies in the Crows, on whose territory they had begun to encroach after they had crossed the Missouri River and moved westward toward the mountains. Their battles with the Crows lasted at least 70 years and perhaps longer, but were interrupted by a truce which perhaps endured from 1851 to 1854 or thereabouts. With the Blackfeet still farther to the north, the Cheyennes did not often come in contact, though occasionally they met, and when they met, they fought. The village tribes of the Missouri, Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa, were commonly on good terms with the Cheyennes. This is what we should expect from the fact that these were the first tribes that they met in friendship on the plains, and since they lived with or near them for a long time. Still, there were occasional quarrels even with these people. Maximilian tells of stories of battles with the Cheyennes that he heard from the Mandans, while the Cheyennes give accounts of fights that they had with the Arikaras. On their way west, perhaps long before they reached the country of the Red River, the Cheyennes met the Assiniboines, Hohi. It is related that the two tribes came together when each was trying to surround a herd of buffalo. They quarreled over this and came to blows. Old Assiniboines have told me that at this time the Cheyennes were armed only with clubs and with sharpened sticks, and this is precisely what the Cheyennes themselves say. The Assiniboines, however, had guns and killed a number of the Cheyennes and scalped them. The sound of the guns and their dreadful power terrified the Cheyennes, and they fled. As they had never before been attacked by enemies, the Cheyennes did not know what to make of the situation. But after a time one of them stood up and harangued the people and said, "Now we have fought with these people, they attacked us and have killed some of us. After this let us fight with all people we meet, and we shall become great men." So they began to fight all tribes wherever they met them, and it did make great men of them. They came to be great warriors and took many prisoners. However, there is a tradition of a time when the Cheyennes and their kindred, the Sutai, lived in the far northeast, long before the battles with the Hohi, when those two tribes fought with one another. During their last great fight they discovered that they spoke a similar language and that they were related, and then made a peace which was never broken. Not a few traditions are handed down of the battles of the Cheyennes and the Hohi, in which the Cheyennes were always defeated. Some Cheyenne authorities include the Ojibwa among the Hohi. It was the practice of the Hohi to come at night to attack the Cheyenne camps. They carried horns made of the hollow stems of some plant, with which they signaled to each other, making a call like that of the buffalo in spring, so that, if the Cheyennes heard them approaching, they might suppose buffalo were coming and thus not be on the lookout for the enemy. They slew many Cheyennes. An oft-told story explains how a dog saved a family from death by the Hohi. In those days, a man, his wife, and well-grown son were camped apart from the tribe. They had a dog whose puppies were in the lodge. One night the mother dog went out to look for food for the puppies, and returning to them after a time began to cry over them and lick them. The man saw what she was doing and wondered. He spoke to the dog and said, "Why do you do this? If you know that something bad is going to happen, tell me what it is. We do not wish to die. If we are in danger, help us, and we will save your puppies. Try in some way to help us." After he had spoken thus to the dog, she went out of the lodge, and was gone for some time, and then came back and stood in the lodge looking toward the door. The man's wife told him to take up the puppies. He put them in his robe on his back, and they all made ready to go out. But first the man made up a large fire in the lodge, so that anyone who saw it would suppose the people were still there. The dog left the lodge, and they followed her, and she led them down to the river and straight across. After a time they heard guns sounding all around their camp, and they knew that the Hohi were attacking the lodge with a fire burning in it. They went on to another camp where the Cheyennes were living and told them that the Hohi had attacked their lodge. So the Cheyennes moved away and all escaped. The story of how the dog saved her master has been told in the camp since that time. For a long time the Cheyennes possessed no arms that they could use in fighting the Hohi. They talk much about those dreadful days, and tell of the terror that they felt of these enemies, of the triumph when, on rare occasions and through some accident, they succeeded in killing one, of the care with which their camping places were chosen to avoid attack, and of how finally, through the ready wit of an old woman, they succeeded in obtaining a few guns. In those days, long before they had horses, they traveled from place to place, packing some of their property on dogs and carrying the rest on their backs. Once the people were camped in their earth lodges and were chasing buffalo on foot. They had hunted for 3 or 4 days and now had abundant meat. They left this camp and moved a short distance down the stream. One old woman, however, who was busy making grease, remained at the old camp. She said, "I shall stay here for a time because I wish to finish pounding up my bones and boiling them and skimming off the grease." The night was dark and the old woman was alone in the camp. She was still boiling her bones and skimming the grease from the pot. She had made a torch and tied it to a stick and thrust the stick down her back between her dress and her body, so that the torch stood above her head and threw light on the pot. She was blowing the grease off the water when a person entered the lodge and sat down by the head of her bed. She did not look up, but kept blowing the grease from the water. Then one after another walked into the lodge, about 50 great, tall Assiniboines. There was plenty of food hanging in the lodge, and at one side was some pounded meat. The Assiniboines said to each other, "We will get something to eat first, and then we will kill her." They made signs to her that they were hungry, and to each one she gave some pounded meat, and they began to roast some fresh meat. The old woman was badly frightened. She kept saying to herself, "They will surely kill me. What can I do to save myself?" Hanging up in the lodge was a great sheet of back fat, tallow, and the old woman took it down to roast it so that the visitors might eat it with their meat. She put it on a stick and hung it over the fire until it began to cook, and the hot grease was dropping from it. Then, lifting it as if to turn it, she took it from the stick and gave it a mighty swing around her head, throwing the hot fat in the faces of the Assiniboines sitting around the circle, and all jumped back burned. Then she rushed out of the lodge. Not far in front of the lodge was a high-cut bank above the river with rocks below. The Assiniboines, furious with their burns, rushed after the old woman, following the torch that she carried over her head. She ran fast toward the bank, and when close to it threw her torch ahead of her and turned sharp to one side, running along the edge of the bank. The Assiniboines followed the blazing light and all ran over the bank and, falling on the rocks below, were hurt or killed. The old woman hurried away after the Cheyenne camp and overtook it. She told of the Assiniboines who had come to her lodge, and of what she had done, saying, "I could hear them fall over the cliff. I think all fell over." The next morning the men returned to the old camp, and here under the bank they found the 50 Hohi, some of them dead, some with broken backs, some with broken legs, and some with broken arms, creeping about. They killed them all and secured their guns. The Cheyennes were driven by the Assiniboines in a southwesterly direction until they reached the Missouri River, not far from where Fort Pierre now is. Here for a long time they remained, living with the Mandans and the Arikaras in earth lodges, raising their crops and making journeys away from the village to secure game, or to catch fish, to gather the eggs and young of water birds in summer, or to collect skunks in the autumn when they were fat. Later they wandered out on the plains after buffalo. 2. The Ways of Warriors. After the question of providing subsistence for himself and his family, the main thing that occupied the mind of the Cheyenne was the protection of his people from the attacks of enemies and the effort to reduce the power of those enemies by attacks on them. The fighting spirit was encouraged. In no way could a young man gain so much credit as by the exhibition of courage. Boys and youths were trained to feel that the most important thing in life was to be brave, that death was not a thing to be avoided, that in fact it was better for a man to be killed while in his full vigor rather than to wait until his prime was past, his powers were failing, and he could no longer achieve those feats which to all seemed so desirable. When a man was old, he could no longer get about easily. The labors of the hunt and of the warpath were too much for him. He was pushed aside by the more active and vigorous. He lost his teeth. He could not enjoy his food. He sat on the cold side of the lodge. Life seemed to hold for him nothing good. How much better, therefore, to struggle and fight, to be brave and accomplish great things, to receive the respect and applause of everyone in the camp, and finally to die gloriously at the hands of the enemy. Among the Cheyennes, as among other plains tribes, this feeling was very strong. They fought not only to gain the approval of their tribesfellows, but for pure enjoyment of the struggle, real gaudium certaminis. The spirit of the camp was such that young men going into battle thought of it as the beginning of a good time that they were to have. To them, fighting was real joy. Perhaps they regarded their fights somewhat as the big game hunter of modern times regards his pursuit of dangerous game. The personal risk must have added enormously to the excitement and enjoyment of the contest. The chapters in this book are devoted chiefly to conflicts between considerable bodies of men, but it must be remembered that the war paths of the Plains Indians were carried on in a great variety of ways. Men might go off with a special purpose, 1, 2, or 3 together, or a great war party of hundreds might go. They journeyed on foot or on horseback according to circumstances. It will be readily conceived that among people who possessed ideals such as these, there would be many exciting adventures. From a mass of individual stories and accounts of small war parties, I have chosen 3 which will perhaps give some notion of the ways of warriors. The Death of Mouse's Road. In 1837, the year before the great fight with the Kiowas and Comanches, the Cheyennes were camped on the South Platte River. A war party of 14 started south on foot to take horses from the Kiowas and Comanches. Stone Forehead and Pushing Ahead were the 2 who carried the pipes, the leaders. They found the camp of the enemy at the head of what the Cheyennes called Big Sand Creek, which runs into the Red River of Texas. That night the Cheyennes went into the camp in couples. Stone Forehead was with a man named Angry. It was very dark. Close behind a lodge which they passed stood a pole with a shield hanging to it. Angry untied the shield from the pole and put it on his back, and they went on, looking for horses. They came to a bunch of 50 or 60 and went around them and drove them a little way, and each caught a gentle horse, mounted it, and drove off the herd. When they reached the place where it had been agreed that they should meet, they found the others of the party already there, excepting only 6 men. Stone Forehead said, "We cannot wait here. We must start." They did so. Stone Forehead and Pushing Ahead went behind, where it is the custom for the leaders to travel while the others went ahead. They drove their bunches along side by side, but 200 or 300 yards apart. When day came, they looked carefully at their horses so that they could know them again, and then they bunched the horses into a single herd. The way was so rough that they drove very slowly, and Pushing Ahead, who knew the country, kept saying, "We are going so slowly that they will surely overtake us." It was a little past the middle of the day when they saw the Kiowas and Comanches coming. There were only a few of them, not over 30. Then the Cheyennes began to catch the swiftest horses so that they could get about quickly. Pushing Ahead was a brave man. He said, "We must not let them take our horses. I do not think there are many of them." The Cheyennes mounted the fast horses and bunched up the herd, and, sending 2 young men ahead to ride one on each side so as to hold the horses together, they stopped. One of the Cheyennes got off his horse and fired at a Comanche and shot his horse through the body. The Comanche rode back, and soon his horse began to stagger, and the Comanche left it and mounted behind one of his fellows. Then the Cheyennes made a charge on the Kiowas and Comanches, and they turned about and went back. Of the other 6 men, 2, Little Wolf and his partner Walking Coyote, were alone. They were on the head of the Washita in level country. They had taken only a few horses. They saw a big party of Kiowas and Comanches coming in 2 bands. There was a ravine near them, and Little Wolf said, "These horses are tired out. We cannot drive them much farther. The enemy will soon overtake us. Let us dismount and hide in this ravine." They ran down the ravine and hid in a little hollow and lay there. If the Kiowas had looked for them, they would have found them, but just then they saw the 4 other Cheyennes far off and turned to rush them. Little Wolf and Walking Coyote stayed there till night and then set off for home on foot. When the Kiowas and Comanches charged Mouse's Road and his 3 companions, the Cheyennes did not run. They rode up on a little hill and got off their horses and began to kill them. They had already left behind the horses they had taken, and had only those that they were riding. Now, as the Kiowas and Comanches came up, the Cheyennes were seen to be taking off their leggings so that they could run fast and easily. The enemy charged them, and the Cheyennes fought bravely, though they had but few arrows, for they had been out a long time. In a little while the enemy had killed 3 of the Cheyennes. Early in the fight, Mouse's Road's bow was broken in 2 by a ball, and he threw it away. A Comanche chief, seeing him thus disarmed, charged up to kill him with his lance, but Mouse's Road avoided the blow, caught hold of the Comanche, pulled him from his horse, and killed him with his knife. Mouse's Road was still unwounded. He let the Comanche's horse go and signed to the Kiowas, "Come on." There was a man named Lone Wolf, a chief and a brave man, who had been behind the other Kiowas. He called out, "I have just come, and I wish you all to look at me. I intend to kill that man." He said to a Mexican captive, "Do you ride close behind me." The two charged upon Mouse's road, and the Mexican rode straight at him. But Mouse's road, though on foot, did not run away. He ran to meet the Mexican, and, springing at him, seized him, pulled him from his horse, and plunged his knife into him several times. While he was doing this,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?